Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting for Tuesday, October 3rd, 2017. Today, Jordan's going to start us off talking about some 1.8 issues.
All right. So when people started upgrading from 1.7 to 1.8, there were reports that restarting nodes or API servers, primarily nodes, was encountering data loss issues. And we tracked that down to the default location of certificates where the kubelet places its certificates. And that was defaulting to a transient location, var run Kubernetes, which gets erased on reboot. And so that was making nodes go into hung states where they couldn't talk to the API anymore. So we did two things. First, we updated the config that kubeatom uses to stop putting certificates in a transient erased location and place them under varlib kubelet PKI, which is the same place that GCE, GKE put them, and is a more appropriate location for runtime data that we expect to persist. So that is a change in the right direction, and that stopped the data loss issue and allowed upgrades from 1.7 to 1.8 to work. Because it was just a config change, we were able to release packages that made that change without any binary changes. A side effect of that change was reported today, which is that kubeatom on a clean install does a pre-flight check of a bunch of different paths and really wants the varlib kubelet folder to be empty, like completely empty, despite the kubelet crash looping in the background by design. So by design, the kubelet is running, being told to put state in that folder, and so kubeatom is hitting a false positive on the pre-flight check, saying, I see stuff in this directory, I'm not going to install. And so that pre-flight check is actually incorrect. If the kubelet is supposed to be running in the background, then kubeatom should not expect that folder to be empty. So there is a pull to remove that pre-flight check specifically, but we need, at the very least, known issue documentation, workaround guidance. There's discussion in the reported issue, and a pretty reasonable thing to do if you're scripting bringing up a known clean machine. You can remove that folder and then run init or join, and the folder gets created as part of that process. But wanted to make folks aware of this and get eyes on these issues and the PR so we could get that reviewed and into the 1.8x stream, and so that as people hear reports or people affected by this, we can point them at this one issue and make sure that people are aware of the workarounds.
The immediate workaround is just to skip the pre-flight checks, at least temporarily, or at least take a look at the output results for pre-flight checks and do a skip. And that would at least get you past the current binaries until we have a fix out.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how, if it short-circuited on the directory check and skipped a bunch of other things. My concern about having people skip pre-flights is that it's not going to make sure a bunch of various tools and things are present, and it's actually going to start doing the install or the init and then fail further down the line. That's good feedback. I don't know which we would rather have them do. Skip pre-flight entirely and not know that Docker's not there and like other kind of critical things like that, or target this one directory on a known clean state. What are people's thoughts?
The pre-flight checks currently allow you to run them and fail, and you'll get the output results should be of the entire run.
Okay.
They should be. And if they're not, that's another bug. So I purposely had to skip pre-flight checks because I'm using overlay 2 by default.
Mm-hmm.
So I ran as soon as the binaries became available, I ran 1.8 and saw overlay 2 failed, and then I had to skip pre-flight and did init and a fresh cluster, and I did not see an issue after that. But this was a known good happy path. So
Right.
For non-happy paths, I'm a little. I think we should probably try to turnkey 1.8.1 as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I know of one other fix to a known 1.8.0 issue that we will probably hold 1.8.1.4. My guess is 1.8.1 will be cut early next week. That's my guess, in the absence of other critical issues, but we will see.
Jordan, question: why it was not a directory etc Kubernetes PKI?
Excuse me, I didn't hear what the question.
Why you put with certificates in var lib Kubernetes PKI? Why not etc Kubernetes PKI?
Because this is where the kubelet generates those. So etc Kubernetes is typically for configuration that is not generated. So PKI, this is where auto-rotated client certs and self-signed server certs are placed. And so we don't want the kubelet modifying its etc directory.
Just to dovetail on what Jordan said, varlib is always typically for runtime, and etc is static.
Right.
Okay.
So the PR against master that resolves this is actually pending approval from one of the kubeatom owners. So I tagged Lucas and Mike, but if someone else wants to jump in who is able to look at that and approve or provide feedback, that'd be helpful to get that working through the process. And that's all for me.
I don't see either Lucas or Mike on the call, so if anybody else has a chance, that would be awesome. Thank you, Jordan. So next on the list, Wojtek pinged me this morning about wanting to cut a new 1.7 release, and that there were two tests in the 1.7 release blocking suite for kubeadmin that are both failing. The good news here is that he's not cutting the release, ignoring our failing tests anymore, because that has definitely happened in the past. The bad news is we need to now go look at these tests and figure out why they're failing and either fix them or let him know that it's okay to cut the release without them. So I linked to the two failing tests in the meeting notes. It's the running 1.6 on 1.7 and upgrading from 1.6 to 1.7 are both sort of hard failing at the moment. So I don't know if there's any volunteers to go look at those. This is somewhat time critical because I think Wojtek wants to cut the release sort of ASAP. Jacob said he could take a look. Thank you, Jacob. Excellent. All right. Moving on. Jamie or Tim, HA etcd.
Yeah, so I can just give some quick context and then maybe hand it off to Tim. So about 4 or 5 months ago, I opened up an issue trying to structure the discussion about how we want to handle etcd and HA capacity. So one of the ideas was to use the CoreOS etcd operator. And so I opened a pull request quite a long time ago now, and it's kind of sat in review because it wasn't deemed a priority for 1.7 and 1.8. So now that we're starting to focus again on HA, I think we should probably reinitiate this discussion about what we want etcd to look like in a HA capacity and whether we think etcd operator is a good fit. So Tim, do you want to take over discussion here, or is there anything yeah?
Well, there was a conversation piece. It's too bad that Lucas isn't here. I was hoping he would be able to discuss it because there was a piece about security and how secrets were being handled in the etcd operator use case that Lucas's counter proposal addressed. And the comment I made on your PR yesterday was whether or not we want to continue to evaluate this or if we wanted to go with the other proposal. And I think we need to have a conversation with Lucas and perhaps on the other day, on the off day where we discuss just this topic, to outline some of the constraints that we want to address in the next cycle. I think I still have a concern with Lucas's proposal in that we will, kubeadm or some other tooling is now going to have to manage etcd updates versus the operator, which actually does some of this for you.
Right. Yeah, I can't quite remember Lucas's proposal. Have you got a link to it? Could you throw
Well, he's basically using the TLDR on Lucas's proposal is he's using static manifests, static pods as before, but doing some cribbing with secrets using CRDs to transfer data back and forth across nodes.
Okay.
You wince a little bit to make sense out of it but he wants to not have any auxiliary tooling, and the joke was that you're using CRDs as FTP, but
okay, yeah. So I think it's probably best if like maybe a few of us have a look through that proposal because a lot of the details escape me right now. Just one last question, like so with Lucas's proposal of like an amended static pod thing, is that mutually exclusive with using the etcd operator? I mean, do we need like one thing or?
I don't necessarily think they're mutually exclusive. I think we could potentially have a option enable type of scenario, but it adds to complexity then.
Yeah.
Right? So I think as long as we exercise some jurisprudence on the option enabling, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I would ideally like to have a set of configuration that we pass into kubeadm that's rationalized for both scenarios.
Yeah, it's a bit messy right now, etcd configuration. Yeah, because I thought that any solution that we did come up with, it would have to be feature gated in some way, which we have now. So,
yep.
Yeah. Okay,
and
cool.
Also, with every feature gate, to get test coverage, like every time you add a gate, you're doubling, tripling your coverage matrix, and we're not in a good state there now. So just being aware of what we're adding there.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, like, although I don't personally think that the etcd operator is a good idea, I support the idea of having different ways of running etcd, and I think an interesting way of doing it is to say kubeadm can like use etcd for some state where it needs it, and there may be like different plugins or options for how to do it. And there's static pods, which we sort of have today. There's the etcd operator. I did some research about this, and there are actually a lot of etcd operator equivalents that don't rely on Kubernetes at all that are in actual production. So that's certainly interesting. Like I know Zalando has one. Monsanto has one. So there are definitely other alternatives out there that are maybe more tested and actually have real world usage. So I think the idea of saying that kubeadm can like shell out or exec to something that can then install etcd is maybe a good option. I do think though that there is a lot of certainly in the HA scenario, once we assume we have etcd, we're able to use etcd for a lot of cross-instance configuration. I think that will make life easier. So this is an important thing to figure out.
Yeah, I think maybe tabling until Lucas is around and we can have a discussion almost just on this topic alone would probably consume all of tomorrow.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. I think this is a good topic to bring up in this meeting, but I don't think we want to try to solve it in this meeting and sort of leave the proposal for solutions to the breakout meeting. But make sure people in this meeting are aware that will be discussed. And so if they're interested, they can attend the breakout meeting. Awesome.
What time is the breakout tomorrow?
Same time, it's at 9 Pacific. And if there's a specific topic that people want to discuss and can't make that time, we can also move the time around to make sure the right set of people are discussing it. So please do speak up if there's something you really want to talk about and that time doesn't work for you. CAD, you're next. 1.8 cherry picks.
Yes, so it's my two topics. So when we were testing the final RPMs for 1.8, we found two issues. One issue was related to certificate rotation, which probably Jordan already talked about. So we made a patch for automatically approving node certificate rotation in master. Now we need to have the same thing cherry picked to 1.8 branch. And second thing was using kubeadm 1.8 to upgrade between 1.7x to another 1.7x. It's also fixed. Lucas is not available, so he asked yesterday in Slack. So I pinged our people in this SIG and see if somebody can review and put appropriate labels on it.
Okay, so just to clarify, the pull requests have already been merged to master, and you're just looking for the cherry pick to be approved?
One merge to master and needs to be cherry picked approved for 1.8. Second pull request is 1.8 specific.
Okay.
It's not applicable for master.
Okay, great. So the one that needs to be cherry picked into 1.8, the procedure for that is to have sort of the normal approvals go while you merge it to master, and then to have the branch manager approve the cherry pick. So you don't actually need somebody from this call to approve your cherry pick. You need Joe Betts, who is the patch release manager for 1.8, to approve your cherry pick. Because the intent there is that the people from the SIG have already approved your code change, right? It's already in the master branch. So they're not the people that are managing the release branch. It's the release branch manager that is managing sort of the risk of the release branch letting things go into it. Because otherwise, every SIG would say, oh, all of my stuff is really important. Let's all backport it into the release branch and then sort of having a single person controlling that flow gives us a lot more confidence that the release branch will remain stable. And they're also responsible for sort of making sure they don't break the tests as they go along.
Okay. But the second is anyway needs a reviewer from this SIG.
Yes, the second one does. Yeah, so we should assign 53325 to Joe.
That's it. Thanks.
Great. All right, so next on the list, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cluster API effort. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about 1.9 planning. Basically, we're starting to look at trying. I think Chris Nova sent an email out about this a little while back, and we've sort of started making some initial efforts. We're going to, at this point, try to push a little bit harder from the Google side, and we're hoping to get some more community involvement to trying to sort of more formally create a cluster API. So I think Chris Nova's email went out maybe around this time last release cycle, sort of at the beginning of 1.8. And we started making some slow progress, and I think this time we're going to try to make much faster and more significant progress. So I wanted to talk about that, and also I'm happy to talk more about it in detail next week. I didn't want to take up too much time this week because I think that the 1.9 planning discussion is going to basically eat up all available time that we have. So if people have more questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it offline. Or like I said, I'm planning on talking about it in more detail next week. All right, so next is questions about DNS pull requests.
Hey guys, this is Madhukar. Actually, I spoke to Lucas on Slack chat, and he was mentioning that the DNS PRs were discussed last week, and I just wanted to check on which one, basically what's the decision on the PRs, whether we are making the DNS IP as configurable from the file, or how does it look like?
There was a pretty, I would say, somewhat contentious discussion last week about making the DNS IP configurable. And I think quite a few people were in favorable of not making it configurable because we don't want to add too many options to the configuration. One of the complaints and frustrations with usability for KubeUp was that anybody who wanted to add a variable added a variable, and it became variable soup, and became impossible to tell what you could configure, how you could configure it. And so the question was whether DNS actually needed to have its IP be configured, or if we could just pick one and plumb it correctly through the system.
Okay. Yeah, so actually I had sent one of the PR, the first one, which is actually correcting the way the service IP is created to this, in today's DNS. So I just wanted to check, I was being told that the other guy who has submitted the PR to make it as configurable IP will be coming to this meeting. So I was just wondering whether they were here to discuss this DNS.
Yeah, I think looking at the first PR where you're fixing the way we're actually calculating it, there was no contention about that. No contention about that one. It looks like it just hasn't gotten review bandwidth. The second one, making the IP configurable, was the one that we spent more time talking about. And I think people were in general agreement that we should make core DNS a feature because we have sort of punted thus far on properly dealing with system add-ons. And since we already sort of deal with DNS explicitly, and we had talked to the core OS folks about core DNS, it was okay to add that as a feature. And please, if I'm misspeaking, someone correct me.
Okay, so like, what's the timeline? Like, are we going to kind of review this PR again, or merge it, or how does it look like?
Yeah, I think it's up to the reviewers, and if you're not getting feedback from your reviewers, you should maybe poke different reviewers to take a look at it. I think Lucas is pretty busy right now, and I don't think like your first PR, Chris hasn't had a chance to look at it. So maybe we can get some other folks on the call who have owners' rights to take a look at them instead.
Yeah, thanks, Robert.
Excellent. All right. I'd say last call for other things before we jump to the planning doc. All right. All right, so I'm going to pull up in the planning doc. Do people prefer if we do a screen share, or do we just want to talk through it?
Screen share helps because then we can comment in line.
All right, let's see if I can figure out how to do that. I think this will do it. Is that working? Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is basically took a copy of the doc Lucas created for 1.8, crossed off some things that we finished, moved some priorities around as my best guess based on what we discussed verbally, and then just felt like we should go through it together. There's also a couple things that have been added by folks since I took the first pass, but not too many. So maybe this won't actually be contentious. We'll see. So the first thing was Jessica has been, I don't know why Lucas's name is next to this. Jessica has been working on getting automated upgrade testing for kubeadmin. It didn't quite make it for 1.8, and she's in Hawaii right now. But when she gets back, we're going to wrap that up and make sure we have automated testing working ahead and in place before 1.9. So definitely plan to get that done and pretty early in the release cycle. The next one is self-hosting as the default. So this slipped from last time. Last time this was written as upgrades and self-hosting as default, because during this planning meeting last time we thought that those two things were tightly coupled, and it turned out that they weren't as tightly coupled as we thought, and self-hosting slipped, but upgrades didn't. So self-hosting is still here. We believe that sort of all the two things that were blocking us last time we can get done pretty early in this release cycle. You know, Tim mentioned last week that he was making progress on the checkpointing and chatting with Diego and Aaron. They said that once the 1.8 release kerfuffle was done, that they were going to jump back into the surge update strategy for daemon sets and try to get that pushed through with SIG apps. So we have pretty good confidence that the two missing features will get done early in the release cycle, and we can maybe even flip this on in maybe in a couple of weeks, so that alpha builds of 1.9 will have this enabled by default. Also, as part of that effort, I wrote down that we should make some tests, right? We should make sure that the automated upgrade tests we have start testing, self-hosting clusters and upgrading self-hosted clusters. Anything else people want to say about that one? All right. So now we're getting into so those two things I think are pretty uncontentious. It's sort of finishing up stuff that had started last time and we need to finish. So next is sort of new things. So the first one of those is HA. Which I think we've discussed many times. It's something we wanted to target for 1.9. There is at least, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 different HA proposals written by various folks. Lucas has taken an action item to consolidate those into a single proposal. I'm not sure if that's been done yet. And then we want to turn that single proposal into a markdown file that we can get checked in. We discussed during the breakout last week that we don't want to bother going through the process of trying to get this checked into the normal sort of proposals section of the community repo, and instead we're just going to check it into our own repo as a markdown file, largely to avoid the process and overhead of people who are not actively working on this project coming and sort of leaving drive-by comments that oftentimes result in the PR never getting merged. And I'd much rather have it get merged, and we can, if we want, we can also port it over to the community repo in parallel with actually getting some work done. There are lots of sort of design pivot points that I don't think have been sort of fully fleshed out or maybe agreed to by everyone. So as we create that PR and as we iterate on the document, I would encourage people who are interested to jump in there and make sure that that we're getting the requirements right. I know that in the kubeadmin blockers, Justin has pointed out a couple of times that the way that sort of the HA design was moving was maybe not compatible with COPS. So if there are requirements we need to make sure we're meeting, we should put those in. And then also in terms of implementation design bits. Oops, wrong button. Great. So next was dynamic kubelet configuration. So this was something that Lucas mentioned last week, and I think he stuck this in there without actually writing what he wanted to do. But I think the short end of it is mtoffen from SIG node has been switching the kubelet over to be dynamically configurable. And we want to enable that in kubeadmin in 1.9 because we believe that that API will go from alpha to either beta or GA. I don't know if they might just jump right over beta. So Luke said something in chat, which I will repeat here. He says, on self-hosting, is it worth adding explicit bullet to make it clear that upgrading self-hosted clusters should be default supported happy path for upgrades? So I think we should discuss this maybe at the breakout, or at least when Lucas is back. Before, what we'd said was we wanted to flip self-hosting on as the default for a release cycle, but not actually upgrade people into self-hosting until the following release cycle. So what we'd originally been targeting is 1.8 self-hosting as a default. But upgrades from 1.7 to 1.8 stay as static pods. And then in 1.9, we would actually upgrade you to be a self-hosted cluster. We haven't actually explicitly talked about whether that is still true, just shifting by one release, or whether we believe that with 1.9, we should upgrade people into self-hosted clusters. So we should make that explicit. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody wanted to talk? Maybe.
I was just going to say the kubelet versions queue issue, we should probably make sure we have that covered in terms of whatever we do here if we're not going to upgrade kubelet at the same time. Or are we upgrading kubelet?
Can you be a little more explicit by what you mean by these versions queue issue?
So if we upgrade the API server but do not upgrade kubelet, so we upgrade to API server 1.9 but do not upgrade kubelet so it stays on 1.8,
yes.
Like, is that an issue? How far can we skew, and what is going to be the scope of our upgrade, self-hosted upgrade policy or allowances, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the way the upgrade tests are written right now, partially because there was a bug where there was a crash due to a no pointer exception, is Jessica had to do some mechanics with the upgrade testing where we upgrade the control plane first and then we upgrade the kubelet second. So during the upgrade tests, there is a one minor version skew in the middle there, but it's very short-lived during the upgrade test because it literally upgrades the control plane and then upgrade the kubelets.
But we are planning on having kubelet upgrades through the Kubernetes API server in scope of this effort.
No, I think that's separate. So
we've never planned to have self-hosted kubelets. That was never on the priority.
I guess what I'm saying is let's just make sure that we cover this, like the kubelet issue and what we're scoping in and out. I don't want to rabbit hole on like what's possible and what's not.
No, I think it's scoped out, as Tim said.
Perfect.
But the test infrastructure actually does the kubelet upgrade too, so that you end up with a fully upgraded cluster at the end, if that makes sense. So we use the kubeadmin upgrade command to upgrade the control plane, and then out of band, we upgrade the kubelets so that at the end of the upgrade tests, you have a cluster that's been upgraded.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the way the COPS upgrade works, we figure we have to upgrade the kubelet anyway. So the thing which upgrades kubelet also upgrades the control plane. I guess I'm wondering like what the value of the control plane upgrade is if we can't do a complete upgrade through it. So that's where that question comes from, I guess.
Right. So in GKE, we do the same thing, right? When we upgrade the control plane, we upgrade the entire node, which includes upgrading the kubelet. Since kubeadmin is scoped to sort of software running on the node, and I think especially with self-hosting, the intent with self-hosting is you can use Kubernetes, the same tools to manage your cluster as you do your applications. That sort of implies that you're going to be upgrading your control plane separately from the kubelets that are running underneath it. least that was my belief.
Yeah, I don't want to rabbit hole on it, so let's carry on.
That would probably be another good topic to bring up at the breakout meeting. Although now we have a number of those queuing up, so one breakout meeting is probably not going to be enough to cover everything. Okay, so next was Lucas was sort of pushing for this in 1.8, but we didn't get it done, partially because there weren't enough people working on it. But getting sort of an alpha v2 or a beta v1 API for kubeadmin. So we didn't, again, like I said, we didn't have time to finish this. Lucas, I think, has a straw man for what the API might look like. We should get a lot more eyes on that especially before we promote it to beta, and we have to guarantee compatibility. So I'm more inclined to say we should shoot for an alpha 2 this time, especially with the number of other things that people are going to be working on, and try to at least keep iterating and getting more people working on the kubeadmin API.
Do we have people who are, I don't know, deep into the API machinery who have review bandwidth cycles to make sure it's consistent with all the other API stuff? Because I would want to make sure that, you know, they have at least some say along the way. We could maybe poke Andy, but I don't want to sign him up for that unless he's got cycles. If you want to add him in there, that would be fine. Andy Goldstein, just to ask him if he has cycles.
Yeah, maybe you could do that since it's not auto-completing for me.
Sure, I'll do that.
Next time. So next, which is sort of along the same lines, I'd like to get at least a v1 alpha 1 cluster API proposed by the end of this release cycle. You know, technically this doesn't actually, since we plan to build a cluster API as a level above Kubernetes, this is not actually coupled with the 1.release planning or the 1.release or 1.9 release cycle. We can do this anytime we want, but generally people tend to plan things in sort of quarter long or release long chunks. And so basically the goal here is by the end of the quarter or the end of the year or the end of the 1.9 release, we would have this done, even if it's not, you know, happening day and date with 1.9. And we don't have the same sort of feature freeze deadlines or anything, which is nice.
Robbie, quick question on that. Is that just an API definition, or is there going to be common implementation there? Are we going to break it up into, like, because there's ideas on sort of scaling nodes using controllers versus, you know, cluster bring up the first time, versus, you know, being able to recreate clusters. I mean, is it, yeah. What is the scope of that?
I'm happy to go into that. I don't want to derail too much, although we have quite a few. We have like 25 minutes left, so maybe we can spend a few minutes talking about that.
I don't want to derail things either, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I guess just to quickly, we won't have an API. I'd be happy if there was common code, but that's not a requirement. I think we found with the cloud provider implementation that sort of requiring common code leads to bottlenecks and leads to inflexibility for people who don't want to go through your review process. But if you have an API that anyone can implement, then they can plug in their own implementation. So I'm guessing that we'll probably have some common code. But that people are also, like, you know, the Rancher folks didn't want to implement our cloud provider, like they didn't want to plug in code into core, maybe they were told they couldn't, but they still wanted to be able to implement things like the Ingress APIs. So I imagine it sort of happening like that, where we'll probably have some common code for some sort of standard controllers, and if people want to plug in, you know, their code on top of that, they can link in those libraries and implement the APIs themselves. Or they can just ignore the common code and build everything from scratch.
Okay, so the pattern would probably be a little bit more like Ingress, ignoring the fact that the Ingress objects are part of the core and built in versus CRDs, which is what we would do today. But it's more like Ingress, where it's like a common schema with, you know, with a bunch of implementations and maybe a toolkit for building them.
Yes, that's how I imagine it.
Okay. All right, cool.
Do we want to discuss what the scope of that is in terms of, like, I know you and I have chatted a little about this, like, you know, like COPS and GKE both have a cluster object, a node pool or instance group object, and there is a kubeadm, which is sort of the spec for the node. And I guess we want to scope out which one of those, if any of those three, or which set of those three we want to consider the cluster API, or is it another separate discussion?
It might be a separate discussion. I mean, I'm happy to do it in this meeting. Again, I don't want to derail too much or rat hole too much. I can tell you my thoughts, which is that definitely we want to be able to represent either single or groups of nodes, because that's one of the things that gives us consistency across underlying platforms. And we have to be able to represent the control plane. kubeadmin also has to be able to represent the control plane. So as much as we can share the control plane description between a cluster API and kubeadmin, I think we win, because then you have consistency in the layers of your tools. There's also some questions like COPS has things like firewalls, like are firewalls part of the cluster API? GKE has a notion of like which network your cluster is running in, like how many other sort of cloud provider abstractions sort of get pulled into the cluster API versus having it be sort of a more pure layer on top of VMs and control plane. Once you start talking about VMs, you also have to start talking about disks, because disks are attached to machines. So I think there's some question about, in some ways I don't want to try to build an abstraction across all clouds, right? The point isn't to abstract away all cloud resources, but we have to abstract enough of them that we can talk about clusters. So I think there's going to be some discussions about what gets pulled in as part of that.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I think that the set of nodes is going to be the easiest one and perhaps the best defined one of those, with the possible exception of like, if we can say component config, just take care of the control plane, then that makes it really easy. It's not our problem, although maybe it is. But there are at least three efforts I'm aware of. There's the COPS one, the GKE one, and I think eBay has a description of this that's similar. So there are a bunch of these efforts which we could just throw together and.
Yeah, there's more than that too, right? Like Cubo's got one. KubeSpray has a definition of how they define a cluster, which you could call an API. Like sort of any of the sort of higher level tools we built sort of implicitly has a definition of what a cluster means, whether it's sort of synthesized in a YAML file or it's synthesized through environment variables, right?
Yeah, I'm just talking about the ones that have like API machinery ones rather than, yeah.
I think having a strict definition of what is in and what is not in scope is probably going to be super important to the success or failure of a cluster level API, because as you mentioned earlier, you don't want to create an abstraction across cloud abstraction.
Yes, I agree. One more thing I'll say about that is I think Chris had proposed before that we have sort of a separate breakout meeting to work on this. And I think as we start ramping up and have, here are some API definitions that we want to talk about, that's going to become useful. So if people are interested, I can send out a copy of Justin's fun little spreadsheet for when people are available, and we can get that on the calendar as well.
One last question on that. Have you been talking to the Lutzy folks? I know,
No.
and so they were exploring this idea of Kubernetes objects causes node to be created versus sort of the inversion, which plays into sort of what does a node pool look like? Do we use the native, thing versus letting sort of Kubernetes drive? So they might be some good folks to bring in on this, and I think they started writing some code.
Okay, yeah, there was one other project whose name is escaping me at the moment, which I think might have been written by those guys.
I'll dig it up. I think I have it in an email someplace, and I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the thing is there's a lot of prior art here that we don't want to completely reinvent the wheel. We want to sort of make sure we're covering those use cases. But there's also a lot of prior art, which in some ways is bad because it means everybody's doing their own thing. So, all right.
Yeah, Jacob, you got it. It's the Archon stuff or whatever.
Yes, that's the name of it. Was escaping me. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So moving down the list, improving test coverage in kubeadmin. So this was a holdover from last time. Yeah, I think we have better test coverage because we added upgrade tests, but I'm not sure if we actually did any of the things that we'd written down last time, which is things like adding other CNI providers or testing different flags in kubeadmin and creating different sort of test configurations for those. We sort of have one happy path that we run through our tests, both the provisioning tests and the upgrade tests, but we have a lot of flags in kubeadmin and we don't test different combinations of them.
Is part of this, we can discuss this later too. This seems like a lot of stuff already. I don't know how far we're gonna get down this road.
Yeah, I'm just sort of going down if we should sort of adjust priorities and then draw where we think sort of the cut line's gonna be and make sure we focus. Like this one in particular has 3 people assigned to it that are also assigned to things that are higher up in the doc, which makes me think that it is probably not gonna get done unless we either find different people to work on it or we split time, which risks the things that are higher up in the doc.
Yep.
Whereas the next one is assigned to Fabrizio, which is somebody different, and unless he's working on something else, then this one might actually get done, right? Which is better documentation. I think we do have better documentation than we did in 1.7 with 1.8, but there's sort of always room for documentation to improve. And in particular, someone had suggested maybe we create a man page to go with kubeadmin, and we sort of refactor the docs a little bit. There's also this thing that's sort of a carryover, which is delete more outdated solutions. Lucas asks, what more things do we have? If you go look at the Getting Started Guide for Kubernetes, there's still a whole bunch of stuff on there, much of which I don't know if it actually works anymore, because a lot of them were written around the 1.2 timeframe. All right, so the next one, this is also a carryover, which is keep pushing on other SIGs to use component config. So I'd had Mike Denise sign up for this last time, but he got distracted with other stuff. So it currently has no owner, although I've sort of been informally doing this around Google as people complain to me about lack of configurability. I say, no, we've got a way to do it. Please follow the standard procedure here. There was a pull request that went out recently for the scheduler, I think, to use component config. Kubeproxy uses component config, but we'd like sort of the rest of the system to start following the same pattern. I know that the Google folks that are working on Heapster and FluentD are looking at doing it in the 1.9 timeframe also. Oh, and the cluster autoscaler folks too. And the kubelet's on here, and that's dynamic kubelet config, which was covered above.
I was just going to ask, is there a stick we can use here? I mean, is there like, why should someone do this, right? Other than to be a nice person.
Well, the stick for Googlers is that it makes their life easier in terms of managing GKE, which is becoming more powerful over time, which is useful for us. And I think for the rest of the community, this, like, we don't have a great stick. We have a carrot, which is we can tell them that they have fewer flags to plumb through all of the setup scripts. So if they want to test something, it's easier for them. And if we force them to plumb the flags through, if they don't migrate over, then they'll start to feel the pain and have some incentive to move over. So as far as I know, it's that, and we ask really nicely, which is what I've been trying so far.
Not plumb through flags that are not in component config.
Yes. Well, I mean, they can plumb the flags through themselves, and then they feel the pain of having to plumb flags through, and we can ask them to do it on multiple tools, right? So they really feel the pain and say, oh no, did you add it to COPS? Did you add it to GKE? Did you add it to KubeUp? Did you add it to KubeSpray? And like, if you just add it to component config, then you only have to do it once, right?
Yeah, I think this also ties into like Brian's like declarative application management proposal, and I think there is a carrot which I am pondering, which is like if we can give a nice UI to people, right? Like so that they can edit configuration in a like IntelliJ autocomplete type thing. There's an IntelliJ add-on, I think by the OpenShift folk, which like takes the YAML, takes our API machinery schema and does like autocomplete and validation in the editor. And if we can do that sort of, like when you use component config, you get a nice editor or a nice web UI automatically. I think that could be the carrot, but it's probably a long way off.
I think the declarative config stuff is, there's a lot of action there, and we're looking at putting together a working group around application definition, and that's very much focused on app definition. There's obviously some, sort of shared infrastructure with the cluster definition stuff, but I get scared about overloading this stuff too much. That declarative definition doc is pretty overarching and vague, and I'm not sure that it's one of these things where I feel like a lot of people see what they want to see in that. But that being said, component config is a good thing, so we should make that.
Yeah, I don't know that we don't need to couple it to Brian's doc. My reading of Brian's doc was more that it was trying to help address the add-ons issue, which is in some ways orthogonal to component config. But like Justin was saying, if we can say, if you follow these guidelines, you get X, Y, and Z as nice side effects, then those can be other incentives for people to follow the same guidelines.
And also most of these things could be seen as add-ons, right? Like just add-ons that have to be installed.
That's true. Yeah, there are a couple of them that are sort of critical, right? Like the controller manager and the scheduler. But when you read through the list, there's lots of things that actually are add-ons on here.
I think, there is this problem of, and it's probably similar to the application config, which is sort of, I don't want to say cluster config because that makes me think of like the other stuff. It's more like control plane config. Like, what are the pieces? How do they fit together? And I think, we've been talking about add-ons, and I think one of the things we talked about last meeting was, these add-ons in this sort of language that we're using now, the only really critical add-on that we have is DNS. Everything else is really, a true add-on. So like DNS is a little bit different from the rest of it. But getting to the point where this idea that we can break things up and have multiple binaries and add new things in there. Because like right now, if we wanted to add a new standard binary, like say a cloud controller type of thing as a separable thing that we run, like the amount of plumbing that most installed tools would have to do is pretty insane. I mean, like that's a scary prospect for us to try and make that happen across the project. So we need to get past that.
Yeah, other than DNS, Proxy is the other one we do.
Yeah, but we don't. Okay, but kubeadmin doesn't view that as an add-on.
I mean, it starts the daemon set, right?
It does. It's funny though, because I mean, I'm thinking like add-on is in the directory in the Kubernetes /
like the salt stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when people say add-on, they look at that, but really there's a mix of crap there. And so some clarity
the cups distinction is we install things in cups that otherwise the cluster wouldn't come up enough that you can get an API control prompt. So we have to install DNS, and for technical reasons, we have to install networking. That's just a sort of a cups quirk, but that's sort of where we draw the line. But like they are all add-ons, and I would love to have one tool that works for API server. So you can upgrade your API server by adding a new add-on, or suppose a new kubedns version happens to come out that you could just like install that new add-on. Like,
what are you talking about? I understand that.
I don't know.
That never happens. We just cut new Kubernetes releases and tell you to upgrade your entire version of Kubernetes to fix a DNS bug.
I think there is a one-liner which we probably should disseminate, but yes.
Well, I'm not sure there actually is, because the way DNS is installed differs with every tool, right? I think that's one of the problems we have right now.
Okay.
And an easy way to say that is if you install a new version of Kubernetes, then you get, as a side effect, the new DNS using whatever tool you installed. So next, we have 9 more minutes. Bootstrap tokens to GA. I threw this on here as a question to Joe and Lucas. This got pushed to beta. Do we want to keep pushing on it? Do we want to get it to GA? What is blocking us from calling it GA after we let it sit for a couple release cycles?
I think it's pretty much done. I mean, Moira, do you have any comments on that?
I don't know of any specific features that we're waiting for, or I don't know what the general timeline is if we just want to sort of let it mellow for a release in beta. That doesn't seem like a bad idea to me.
So maybe we should target 1.10.
I would say let's make it GA in 1.9. I mean,
there's no reason not to, right?
There's no reason not to. It's stable. I mean, we can keep adding some features there, but I think it's definitely in a good place where it is now.
All right, I'm assigning that to you, Matt.
Sorry, Matt.
I'm gonna go change that. We're gonna go change the flag.
I mean, I guess I don't know what's involved. I know with API versions, it's a pain in the butt to move stuff from beta to GA because you have to write all of the conversion machinery and deal with backwards compatibility and deal with deprecations. Hopefully this is not that bad. We'll see.
I think you just bake a cake which says Bootstrap tokens are GA. That's the requirement. I will try to work on add-on management. I am integrating. I'm trying to understand Brian's doc and the implications for add-on management.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that was a P2 last time. I think that maybe it's still a P2. I think this is something everybody would love to see progress made on, but it's maybe not as important as some of the other things.
There keep being more stakeholders, so it keeps getting harder.
Yes. Yeah, there are more people that care, and there are other things that are distracting us as well. Right? And the last 2 things were things that I copied, I think, from last time, or this one was kubeadmin on SE Linux. There's been an open issue for this for a while that I don't think anybody is actively working on. And then kubeadmin phases and a new API group. So I think new API group is what was covered above. And then the phases is I guess, somewhat related to the API group because the APIs define some of the phases. So this, whoever put this in put it as a P2, where I think I'd put it as a P1.
So this is a lot of stuff.
This is a lot of stuff, I agree. I think historically we tend to get like maybe 3 things done. Maybe a couple more depending on if they're smaller tasks or we have people to split up.
I think it would be really nice if for each item, maybe to follow on at a later time, to have a breakdown of some issues. So those who are, because if we have 15 participants on the call and a certain percentage of us have bandwidth and cycles to execute, but there's a lot more who are sort of waiting in the wings. And if we put help wanted and notifications out, that might actually help to solicit to get more folks involved.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think if you are one of the people that's owning one of these issues, as a first task, breaking it down into sub-steps, filing sub-issues for those, and for ones that can be sharded out to people that want to help contribute, marking those appropriately. I think we've done a not great job at that in the past, and we just sort of kept in our heads like this is what we have to do, and not sort of made that really explicit through GitHub, where other people can find it and have it be discoverable.
Yeah, we did that on HA in the beginning breakdown of the pieces that needed to be done, and Jamie joined the party, which was great actually. So I think there's precedent for success, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and especially ones like Lucas assigned himself, like the dynamic config one. But if he describes like here's what it should be, like that might be a project that someone else could pick up also.
Agreed.
So we've got 4 more minutes. It's probably not worth trying to break things down during this meeting. Do people want to throw out where they think the line is going to be as guesses? Part of this is that the things we think we're going to get done, we should file feature issues for to get it onto sort of the SIG PM and SIG release radar as things that we think are coming in 1.9.
First 2 items already have feature list items or have feature repo entries.
Does HA? I thought HA might also.
It does. It goes back to Epoch almost.
Yeah. Okay. So this one almost certainly doesn't. This one might, because I think this one Lucas was shooting for the last time and it slipped, so he might have filed a feature issue for that. This certainly doesn't have one. Test coverage doesn't really need a feature issue, although like I said, I'm not sure that we have people to work on that this cycle. So bootstrap tokens, Matt, you should file a feature issue about that. Thank you. And then add-on management definitely has one.
For the testing stuff, I have a pull request which needs a few tweaks, and then a big part of that testing thing should be done for the CNI stuff.
Sweet.
Yeah.
That's great news. Which, out of curiosity, which CNI providers is it adding?
I think for now Flannel, and then maybe some other ones in the future. But right now Flannel.
Cool.
One thing I didn't see here on any of this list was conversations that I don't know if Jacob is still on or not. He is. That Jacob and I were having from the release process was to help to kind of get things out of Anago and possibly have it part of the auto builds. Yeah, he said RPMs. I want to get those in place for the next release, as well as some other release kerfuffle issues that existed, including CNI is like super old version that we are currently supporting when there exists a 060. So there's multiple pieces in place that need to get updated, and there's a couple of issues I'll have to dig through and link back to this main document. Jacob, if you have time, maybe I'll ping you on Slack later on to discuss some of the current work that's done in Bazel and how to maybe work on getting RPM as part of the build process too. So that way every build is like a release.
Awesome. Jacob is silent, but saying in chat that he agrees. Sorry, I think I stepped on somebody.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, so I understand the big problem is like the signing process of RPMs, if you want to split it out of Anago. I don't know if that's.
You can build regular RPMs and then sign them afterwards. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that.
All right, that brings us to the end of the doc. I think maybe people should take a week to think about things, start breaking things out in issues, and then next week we can draw a line and make sure we have all of our feature issues filed. I haven't seen an email announcement about the deadline for feature issues, but I assume it's coming up here pretty soon because during the last release cycle it was very early.
Another thing that already has a feature issue that's partly in this SIG is the core DNS behind a feature flag or 1.9.
Yes. And that was one of the PRs we discussed earlier in the meeting also. All right. If there's nothing else, I think that should wrap it up for today. We have about 30 seconds left, so that was perfect timing. Great. Thanks, everyone. We'll see people tomorrow at the breakout meeting, and if not, we'll see everybody next Tuesday. Have a good week.